Hello everybody, and welcome to the second seminar hosted by the CGIAR Gender and Breeding Initiative on the topic of changing sorghum breeding in Mali through gender insights. My name is Thiele, and I'm the program director for the CGIAR research program on roots, tubers and bananas. So I'm going to be moderating today's session, which has a joint presentation by Eva Weltzein and Krista. Eva is an honorary associate in the agronomy department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Krista is an associate professor of international seed systems at Michigan State University. Both Eva and Krista were involved in sorghum breeding in Mali. Bit of a background here. This is the CGIAR Gender and Breeding Initiative, which is hosting the webinars. And our idea is that for plant and animal breeders to meet end user needs, they must understand the priorities that women and men assigned to genetically determined traits. So we need well-targeted variety profiles, which should help us lead to greater adoption of improved varieties, and that should in turn lead to better impact of our breeding programs. Now, if we overlook traits important to women, so that could aggravate household food security and actually block our efforts to overcome poverty. Now, breeding programs could really benefit from practical methods and tools to be more gender responsive. And so by considering those gender differences, we can have greater value and impact. So the CGIAR Gender and Breeding Initiative has the following goals and coordination. We'd like to develop a strategy for gender responsive breeding with supporting methods, tools, and practices. Now we're bringing together plant and animal breeders and social scientists from across CGIAR centers and research programs and other partners. The initiative is coordinated by the CGI Research Program on Roots, Tubers and Bananas and the International Potato Center. We have an innovation workshop on gender responsive breeding coming up. That's being held from 5th to the 7th of October in Nairobi, Kenya. That should bring together a group of social scientists, plant and animal breeders to contribute to developing strategies for gender responsive breeding with supporting methods, tools and practices. And that's going to build on the findings of an earlier workshop we held in 2016 on gender breeding and genomics. We're also hosting 3 webinars as part of the initiative this year. This is the second one, and the idea of the webinars is a knowledge sharing tool to provide insights and to reinforce and deepen understandings on how to achieve gender responsive breeding across the CGIAR. Amongst other things, we'll be featuring work of some of the postdoctoral research fellows working on gender in the CGIAR. On this, today's webinar is going to feature work by Eva and Krista. And Eva's been engaged in plant breeding, developing and using participatory breeding methods and seed system studies and training. And Krista has worked on research engagements around participatory research, seed systems, crop ecology, and gender. So a nice interdisciplinary mix across the two of them, which is really what we're looking for. Okay, so that I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm going to invite, if I get back to my, I'm going to invite now Eva to make her webinar presentation, please. Eva, so over to you, and you have about 15 minutes.
Okay, so thank you very much for this nice introduction. So I will be presenting the first part of our joint presentation and giving you more the story and the background of the sorghum breeding program in Mali that I managed for some 17 years. So my first slide gives you a little bit of an overview of what the situation was when it was analyzed by an impact assessment study of sorghum variety adoption in Mali in 1995. And the study showed that there was reasonably good adoption of reselected local varieties of sorghum in Mali, whereas newly bred varieties that were mostly of a different sorghum race were very poorly adopted. They had different plant growth habit, different planicle architecture, and different grain qualities. At that time, seed multiplication relied on the National Seed Service, but already it was clear that support to those kind of national service providers was waning away Similarly, support to the breeding research was also reducing significantly. A snapshot of the sorghum breeding at the time that I took the program over in 1997. Our research station is actually based in the main sorghum growing area, which is a very great advantage. Mali had just evaluated their national germplasm collection in collaboration with ICRISAT and the US Gene Bank, so there's a lot of awareness about the diversity and qualities of the local germplasm available. And a lot of partners, extension services, NGOs, and the national researchers were actually very open to trying out participatory research methods. Similarly, at that time, physiologists were starting to get results on the importance of photoperiod sensitivity for sorghum adaptation in Mali, and that really means for yield stability, which was one big difference between local varieties and a lot of those newly bred varieties, which were all photoperiod insensitive. In addition, we realized that Mali's oral culture was a great growing ground for participatory research, as it really gives everyone a voice to speak. So what we tried to do was to make sure that we set priorities for the program in a way that we can achieve impact, and thus reviewed who is actually our target group, which kind of target environment are we wanting to serve with the breeding program, which germplasm base can be used to do that, what will be the key selection criteria, what type of varieties will people need. In sorghum, we have an option to breed line varieties that are rather uniform and stable, or hybrids. And since we were quite clear that we will work with a large number of partners, it needs to be clear who will be responsible for what. To get to these priorities, we used assessments of different aspects of the production system, the environments, as well as farmer seed management, and specific studies on farmers' needs and preferences. What I will be presenting now is a summary of some of the key learnings, not so much the methods. Krista will later on go into some more detail on some of the methods and present some specific results. So I will give you now a first overview of what we learned about who does what in sorghum production in Mali. And for those of you who are not familiar with West Africa, households in the western part of West Africa can be very large, up to 100 people or even more working and eating together. And it is managed by usually always a chef de famille who is responsible primarily to provide the whole family with staple food. And so he is responsible to manage the production and the storage of grain produced. All men and women and also the children provide labor for the production of the staple crop, and it's grown in what people commonly call the family fields. Women and men, in addition, get assigned individual fields for their own production so they can make their own income and contributions to the households. Those fields may change from year to year as managed by the chef de famille. There is no private land ownership, but traditional land use rights. Women are responsible, like in many situations, for food preparation, and this includes firewood collection as well as water collection. Women are also responsible for providing ingredients for the sauce, so anything you eat with the staple food. And fields that women use are usually assigned, women get assigned fields that you can qualify as being at the end of rotation. That means when the family field doesn't yield enough cereal yield anymore, they get handed over to women to grow legumes as a first step to recover soil fertility. In addition, women also grow either lowland or upland rice according to the ecological conditions that's available in the villages. So what does this mean? What did this mean for the beginning of our sorghum breeding work? First, it was clear we need to involve these chef de famille and variety evaluations because they're the ones taking decisions about which varieties to grow, and if they grow the bulk of the staple food for the family, so the bulk of sorghum is produced by them. But we need to involve women in the evaluation of grain qualities because they are the ones processing for food security, for food preparation in the family. It also meant that we explored the use of local germplasm as base material to breed for improved yield while maintaining adaptation and grain quality traits, because it was very clear that the so-called newly developed varieties had very different grain qualities to the local varieties. And Krista will be presenting more details about these differences. When we started the sorghum breeding, as I said, we mostly worked with these chef de famille and other men for conducting variety evaluations. But we realized through some specific studies that women actually also all grew sorghum. All women we interviewed ended up saying that they also grow sorghum, in addition to the other crops that they grow. They very often grow it as an intercrop in their groundnut fields. And they have some serious limitations for managing their fields, as they don't own any oxen. They need to wait until the oxen are finished with the family fields, and so their fields tend to get sown late. And yield expectations that way are again lower. And they also don't have access to the farmyard manure, which is also reserved for the family fields. The sorghum that women grow, interestingly, is actually used largely to prepare extra meals for young children who need a fourth meal during the day, and the other half is used for sale. So women actually sell a much higher percentage of their grain than men. This family production is really meant for family food security and only gets sold in exceptional circumstances. So this learning, these insights helped us to take the decision that we really need to conduct sorghum variety trials with women separately. And we try to do this on the basis of groups on a village basis. We adapted the trial protocols so that women could test sorghum varieties as an intercrop with groundnut. And we actually started initiating nutrition research on sorghum's contribution to iron in children's diets, as we realized that so much of what women produce goes directly into children's food. In addition, we started monitoring soil fertility in both men's and women's sorghum trial fields. We learned that women preferred very much tall sorghums, and you can see there a picture on the right how tall these things can get for this intercropping situation, because they swerve more, they felt like there was less problems with shading. Women also tended to prefer somewhat earlier maturing sorghum varieties, as the groundnut harvest is very early and they need to liberate the fields, and if the varieties are too late, they get damaged by roaming animals. There was a widespread preference for loose and droopy panicles, like in this upper hand picture, by both men and women farmers. We also became more clear that there's actually a special subrace of these sorghums that's really only grown by women, with a very specific, very hard grain quality that is often translated as rice sorghum. And we realized that women fields really had very poor soil fertility, especially low phosphorus availability. And this graph shows this situation that we found in some 90 fields that were evaluated for phosphorus availability. And you can see there the arrow is about the sufficiency threshold. You can see that basically all of women's fields were not sufficient for phosphorus, and a large proportion of men's fields or family fields were not sufficient either. With this data, it was clear that we needed to elaborate a selection strategy for better adaptation of sorghum varieties to low phosphorus conditions. We also increased our efforts to select for these preferred panicle and grain types, and started actually a program to identify markers for genetic markers for these preferred panicle and grain traits, because we realized we were losing too many entries in the final stages of the breeding program due to problems with those traits. So actually a lot of wasted effort that way of waiting too long to throw these materials out of the program. And based on the same learning, we now routinely involve some women farmers we always involve women farmers in all the on-farm variety evaluations, as well as their own trials. And we bring expert women farmers actually also on the station to look at grain quality visual evaluations in the early generation materials, to be sure that we place enough emphasis on those traits. This is a summary, in a way, a conclusion of roles and responsibilities of women and men farmers' contributions to the breeding program in 4 different stages. Of course, contributions to the priority setting is present or grows out of all of those 4 stages of actual breeding activities. And so in terms of new diversity, women have really initiated and contributed diverse sorghums of this rice sorghum type that the program is actually now handling, to make at least sure that some of those varieties can become available through seed initiatives. Women contribute directly to the evaluation of these progeny rows on station, especially the grain quality criteria. But they also contribute to the evaluation on farms, specifically with the culinary evaluations, with which Krista will also talk about in more detail. They grow their own variety trials in their own fields, often as an intercrop, so this provides very complementary information, and they contribute in terms of seed sales and production, which has been very interesting, as women have been very successful in seed selling activities, which is not at all a traditional activity for sorghum farmers or anybody growing sorghum in West Africa. A good farmer produces his or her own seed, so selling seed is a novelty. A summary of the changes that we made in the breeding program due to women's needs and preferences, but also due to women's skills and knowledge, can be summarized like follows. We developed these methods for on-farm evaluation of processing qualities and culinary preferences that Krista will talk about. The protocols were adapted to facilitate women's trials in women's fields with fewer entries and intercropping options. All farm evaluation data are disaggregated for gender. We initiated research on iron biofortification of sorghum, which has been actually very successful, and women are growing these varieties. We developed a scheme for selection for improving performance under low phosphorus conditions on station and on farm, so to improve selection efficiency. The role of expert women we highlight here specifically, especially for these grain quality traits. And we included these rice sorghums in the selection program. In summary, the priorities for the sorghum breeding program as it stands now, and it may have changed in the last year since we left, but I think basically it is still like this, that the target group are subsistence farm families that grow mostly for food security but have market ambitions. And there's increasing livestock integration, and the target environment is really the Sudan savanna with between 700 and 1200 millimeters rainfall. The germplasm base that the program is working on with now is mostly Guinea-raised sorghums that are largely photoperiod sensitive, and they're diversified with sorghums from other races, specifically caudatum, but also sweet sorghum, and then this special subrace of Guinea margaritiferums. Key selection criteria are the components of food yield, which of course include yield, and Krista will talk more about the other components, focusing on under the low P conditions, as well as some aspects of stover quality for animal nutrition and factors that contribute to yield stability. We are working on two types of varieties, as pure line varieties, but also single cross hybrids. And we have a very efficient system of sharing responsibilities with the national researchers, a wide range of farmer groups and NGOs, as well as extension services in Mali, but also in other West African countries. And here are some of the names of organizations who contributed to this work and are continuing to contribute, as well as some of our donors that have contributed and made this work possible over the last almost 20 years. And here's a list of some source from sheet materials. So with this, I would like to hand over to Krista. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eva. That was really excellent. Very clear. Looking forward to Krista's. Could I just remind participants, if they have questions, please post them on the chat box on the right-hand side, and I'll pick them up at the end so you get a chance to make your questions. So do, if you could do that. So, Krista, we're looking forward to part 2.
All right. Can you hear me okay? Am I there?
Yep. Yeah, we can see your screen.
Great. All right. So as Eva very clearly just showed you, the transformation of the sorghum breeding program in Mali over the last 17 years that really worked towards incorporating women and men in the process of identifying varieties that are or traits that are important for varieties. I want to talk about some of the methods that they developed over that time, and some of the methods I was involved in, and some trait preferences that really cut across the both men and women. And the main point I want to make right now at the beginning, before you get bored or zone out, is that when we think about men and women and their preferences for sorghum, and especially in a staple crop that's for household consumption and some marketing and has been grown for generations, it's important to remember that we're not trying to breed specifically. Sometimes we are, but we're not trying. These traits don't necessarily mean we need to breed differently for men and then breed differently for women. A lot of the times, these trait preferences are based on task groups. For example, women do a lot of the processing. They're interested in food yield and food quality, and men are thinking a little bit more about the production and attributes in the field. So I want to emphasize that these trait preferences that we're talking about are really possible to develop in a single or several varieties that the whole family is going to be more willing to adopt. And so let's go ahead. some of the methods that we've been talking about for gender and breeding, and as part of this gender breeding initiative, are interdisciplinarity, problem-focused approach, task groups, and context-driven. And I can talk about this a little more at the end as well, but as a Bela Teagan and Seamus Murphy and I have been working on some blogs, thinking about these ideas in order to inform our thinking about it, and for this next meeting that's happening in October, I believe, and also as an opportunity to get ideas out there and get feedback from working community, or from the science community and whoever else on what ways we can improve our methods for gender and breeding. Because looking at this list, they're not novel concepts. They're definitely things we've thought about, or development and research practitioners have been doing for the last, or at least since the 70s or 80s, or trying to incorporate that somehow into breeding programs. But it hasn't quite taken. And what is it that keeps us from building these teams that are truly interdisciplinary and can focus and are addressing something based on a problem? For example, as Eva was talking about the phosphorus issue, it took both agronomic studies and talking to people to understand what really was the problem there. And if we can build teams that work around problems, then maybe that's a way that we can improve adoption of some of these varieties that come from breeding programs. And again, regarding the task groups, I think it's important to also, men and women have different preferences, but they also have different roles and responsibilities, as Eva just laid out, especially in terms of sorghum and Mali. And we need to remember that it's not just about the different variety or the different preferences, but about what the roles and responsibilities of people are, and thinking about identifying trait preferences in terms of that. And then context-driven. There's a lot of emphasis on scaling up initiatives, and I think these are extremely important, but we also need to figure out what is happening at the ground level in order to be able to scale up. And we need to understand the context that we're working in. So I want to move back into some of these trait preferences that Eva mentioned. And one of the things that they developed back in 2007 and 2008 was a culinary test. And this really brought in women into the selection process and helped understand what were their needs and their preferences in terms of cooking quality and grain quality. So this method was developed across 2 different zones with 25 villages, and it allowed women to prepare the traditional food, which is called toh, across the different sites. And many different traits have been measured. And since this methodology development, it's been ongoing and happens every year, every 2 years, in order to get feedback on these various traits in the community. So, sorry, my pictures got condensed when I was trying to mail it. But anyway, some of the traits that are measured during this culinary test are grain quality, flour to grit ratio, which is really important in terms of food yield, soaking time, cooking time, the taste, consistency, and color of toh, and then a global score. And it's a really neat process. What happens is that it's like taking a food science lab and dropping it into a village, and the whole village comes together and works on processing these different sorghum varieties that they selected from the field trials to test for cooking quality. And here you can see that, and they also, it's replicated trials. So you can see here that the women are milling the sorghum, and this is used. So throughout this entire process, they're measuring the time it takes to mill or the cooking time, all these different qualities. Here's the grain to flour to grit ratio that's weighed, and then creating the consistency, adding water to the flour in order to get the right consistency for the toh. And then all the women sit down together in these 3 different groups, processing and cooking the sorghum flour into dough, and that's also timed and measured. So it's a great way, the community is all coming together and they measure these different qualities, and then at the end we have 3 replications of about 6 different varieties that they test and evaluate in terms of color, taste, and consistency. And both men and women do these evaluations in these scores. From the evaluation of grain, one of the things we see here, this isn't divided by men and women, but the colors indicate the different varieties. And we can see that there are a lot of different traits that are measured, but also the varieties score differently across these different factors. And so there's trade-offs in how the farmers are which varieties to choose based on these factors. Here's an example of some of the results that we get from the culinary test, and it's looking at the ratio of bran, flour, and grits. And it's sorted along the bottom, if you can see that in blue, in terms of the bran. And the bran is not really usable in the kitchen. So women are interested in the ratio of flour to grits. And if you look at the variety Lampe, for example, it has a really high ratio of flour and then a smaller proportion of grits. Whereas Segutana, here in the middle, has about an even distribution. And what's interesting about this is that it depends in which villages you are in, what their preference is in terms of that ratio. Some families, for example, in CB region, prefer, one of the traditional foods is nonokene, which is eaten with grits. And so they want to have a higher ratio of grits. And then in Coachella, they eat a lot more tow, and so a higher ratio of flour is important. But also it's important to note in Nando, and at the last there on the right, is that there's a really high ratio of bran, and that means that there's going to be a low quality, or there's less food yield. And when you talk to women in interviews and focus groups, this is very important information, because a variety is not going to be preferred if it doesn't have the food yield that they want to have. Here's looking at the same varieties again in terms of the global sensory appreciation of the varieties across villages. And so the colors each represent a different variety, and on the bottom we have the villages. And you can see across villages, there's also quite a variation in which varieties are preferred. And this is in terms of the global sensory appreciation. And other data that is not shown here, we can see that while taste and color and consistency are important factors, and taste is the most important, there's other elements in this global sensory appreciation score that are not captured by those 3 elements. And those might be grain quality attributes, they might be something else in terms that the farmer knows about those varieties. The point of this slide is basically to show that there's several varieties that are, while Whaley on the bottom is the least preferred across all the sites, there's other ones that are greatly appreciated or disliked. And it's important to have some diversity in the varieties that are being released to meet these different needs. So from these culinary tests, we do a lot of feedback sessions. The results are presented to the farmers, and then the results are used to inform the choices for the next trials. And of course, this information also influences what the breeding program does in terms of developing new varieties. So from the culinary tests, we see that there's variety preferences that vary across zones and regions, villages, I mean. There's regional dish preferences that influence these results. The taste, color, and consistency are essential, but there are other elements. And the involvement of the whole community and the evaluation really increases women's voice in the male-dominated crop. So while the head of the household does have the ultimate say in who is growing this crop, in which varieties that they're going to grow, women have a lot of say in this as well. And if it's a variety that doesn't yield well in the household, or it's too hard to pound, or it requires a really long cooking time, or the flour goes rancid very quickly, then these are issues that women will raise. And if they raise the issues loud enough, then they won't, the house, even despite a high yield, the household will not adopt that variety. And that comes to this last point: understanding women's preferences and roles in food processing are essential to improve adoption, because these traits are highly valued, and what women are thinking about in their processing tasks and what men are thinking about in terms of production are both essential in creating what I want to call a composite variety, not the breeding term for composite variety, but this one that brings together these different traits. And if you think about it, over time, farmers have been selecting these varieties with these different traits for generations, and they are a composite of these different preferences. And so as breeders, we need to be able to develop those, maintain those traits, but also improve the quality and the yield and other issues. So the other aspect that we've worked on specifically with Chiako Diallo, a PhD student in Mali, is looking at a little bit more in-depth trait discovery about why these preferences are, what it really means. What are they talking about when they say they like hard grain? Why is that important? Why is the panicle structure important? So we did some in-depth interviews and focus groups with farmers across 2 different regions, and we also did a diversity panicle sorting, where individuals and also groups of both men and women sorted about 80 different diverse panicle forms into groups, and as a beginning talking point to understand their preferences and how they think about these varieties or these types, and then also in order to lead into these interviews. We talked to about 175 different farmers across these 2 areas. And one of the important things that came out, as you can see here, so this is looking at the farmers' panicle type preferences. And there were 5 different types of panicles, essentially, and they categorized them into different categories. And the 5th category, women didn't like it at all. And it's a type of panicle that's densely packed, and is not used for household food consumption. But another important thing that we can see here is the trend that while men and women, like women are categorized, prefer varieties that are in the first 3 categories, they also, the trend of how they like them is similar between men and women. Sorry, all my pictures got condensed here. So Eva mentioned that the Guinea race sorghum panicle form, with the drooping, as you see in this first picture, with the drooping panicle, and it's a little bit loose so that the air can flow through it. Farmers talk about this. They say that this reduces the insect mold complex. It also helps with pest control because the stem is somewhat lighter when the bird can't land on the plant and peck away at the sorghum. They're startled by it, or they can't rest on it and keep eating the seeds, the grain. So it's really important to them in terms of pest control. Another factor that came out was the threshability, how well it's attached to the stem. They want to make sure that it won't fall off in the field, but also when it comes back and they're doing the threshing, that it doesn't stick in the gloom, and that they can easily remove most of the grain. I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to hurry up. But grain hardness here is another issue that came out during these interviews. And if you look at the top 7 criteria there are different aspects of hardness. So this is a really important trait to producers and consumers of sorghum in Mali. And most of these aspects pertain to food yield. So hardness in grain storage. Hard grain allows the variety to be stored longer because insects can't damage it as quickly. Hardness also renders a different amount of that ratio that I was talking about. So they have higher ratios that are also, with the softer grains, it has a different type of flour that makes a different consistency of the dough, and also can go rancid quicker. There's other issues in terms of food yield, for example, the gloom opening, as I talked about in threshing, and then issues with maturity and adaptation. And the way that grain hardness is thought about by men and women is distinct in some cases and similar in others. For example, for grain storage and hardness, men test the grain with their teeth, but they say women know really well whether a variety is hard or not from pounding. And so they consult with each other to figure out which varieties are best for storage. And so there's these different task groups here that you see that pertain to what women and men are doing and how they're thinking about it. But together, these different traits are important in one variety, or at least in two or three. And this comes back to the point that I made at the beginning, so I won't go too far into it because I'm over time. But grain yield is not just about yield, but how much it is useful as food via the whole post-harvest process. And varieties have to combine the necessary adaptation and processing traits in order for them to be adopted. And men and women contribute unique and complementary knowledge to deciding on varieties. And importantly, farmers associate specific panicle types and plant types with a suite of traits. So, So this is just a little plug to think about the different types of methods that we can use for gender and breeding. And we have a blog coming out very soon here that's talking about some of these points. And we would love to have feedback and thoughts and like, do these make sense? Are there ways that we can move this forward? Is it possible within the CG system? And I think this case from Mali is a really nice way of showing that social scientists and breeders working together, and even in a constrained environment where there weren't a lot of social scientists, the sorghum program was able to identify what was needed in these communities in order to improve the types of varieties that are being released. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Krista. That was also excellent. I really like the point there about you're kind of making the village the lab. That was really good. We've got a space now for some questions from the audience, and you can put those onto the chat box. As people think about the questions, I've got a question for perhaps both of you. I think you made a really good point that involving women and men isn't just about trying to understand the differences in their trait preferences. It's also about this idea of a composite variety that builds on their complementary knowledge to get to a better variety for everybody. I think that's a really good point. And then you talked about task groups. Sam might be behind that. And can you explain a little bit more exactly what a task group, how you conceptualize those, and how you actually practically differentiate those task groups as a clarificatory question?
Sure. I'm thinking of task groups, not necessarily, and this is something that has come out of that work with Bela and Seamus and the way that they framed it. And they're both gender scientists first, I think, whereas I am an agronomist first. and I really like this point in that it's sometimes we have men and women that are not, it's not necessarily that we need to divide and talk to men and then talk to women. It's really about who's doing what. And sometimes, men might end up, men and women are working with weeding the crop or doing something in the field. And so it makes sense perhaps to talk to both of them about those issues. Whereas task in Mali, in terms of food processing, it's pretty much exclusively a woman's task. And she's preparing the food, and she's thinking about the storage and different things like that. And so to understand the preferences for those specific tasks, maybe we do need to talk to women. But the idea that it's only about men or women, or maybe there's roles with, across the hierarchy in the family, maybe children or, younger adults work on this aspect. And so we should be talking to them about that task that they're involved in. Does that help some?
Yeah, no, that's a very good answer. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
So there's also intersectionality with age there as well that you mentioned. Yeah, so I've got a couple of questions coming up from the audience. Brilliant. So the first question from Carla is, are all the varieties tested land races, or have you also tested new commercial varieties? I don't know which of you wants to take that one.
The varieties that are being tested are now all varieties that come out of the breeding program. So they come out of crossing programs or random matching populations. And actually, this year, for example, it's 60 new hybrids are being evaluated by farmers in some, I think, 40 villages or so. And so these are really new experimental varieties that farmers are evaluating. The base germplasm is largely the Guinea race, which means it's largely local material from Mali, but also from the neighboring countries in West Africa, who grow a very similar type of sorghum. But it's diversified with making crosses with some of the other races, but in a fairly low percentage, where the program, I think on general, you can estimate that about maybe 12–15% of germplasm or genes in a new line may be from another race, and 80–90% are this local Guinea race. And maybe for those of you who don't really know sorghum very well, the Guinea race has otherwise not been targeted for improvement. So these are the first real results of breeding sorghum of this Guinea race.
Thanks for that answer, Eva. So I've got just a couple more questions coming in now. We've got one from Seamus Murphy, and it's the following. Context-driven preference research. Village-level localities show differences in trait preferences. But how do we move forward with these details? Will this kind of increased knowledge of detailed differences be welcomed by the breeders? You talk about diversity and release of varieties. How possible is this? Very good question.
Well, maybe just talking from experience, in Mali, it was, at least until recently, not very difficult to release varieties. And so we can release actually a whole diverse set of varieties, and farmers choose the ones that they want for seed production. As I mentioned before, and we didn't go into detail in this later on, is initially seed production was all organized through this National Seed Service. But the National Seed Service in the meantime basically is not functional at all anymore. And so we have, actually the farmer groups with whom we did the breeding work have evolved into farmer managed seed cooperatives, and a lot of other cooperatives have joined that kind of activity. So it's these cooperatives that choose which one of the released varieties to produce for seed and to disseminate in their areas largely. So we actually do get adoption of quite a diverse range of varieties. And maybe to back this up a little bit, in earlier studies on this farmer seed management, it was very clear that farmers in the villages use very many different varieties. We found that in every village where we did these studies, at least 10, often 12, 15 or more varieties were grown, and everybody knew them. So there is a capacity to manage diversity, and so far it was possible to manage that also within the formal sector, or at least through the somewhat formal release system.
So I can ask a follow-up question, and that's a good answer about that. There's diversity in preferences, and also diversity in actually what gets adopted. But do you have an idea about how wide is that adoption? Is it already very localized? With you release a lot of different things, and they're adopted very locally within, or are you seeing broader adoption of a wide set of common varieties? What does that adoption pattern look like with this change strategy?
Yeah, I mean, initially when the differences also of the varieties that we could release was not so phenomenal to what the local varieties could do, I think we got more localized adoption, but of a more broader range of very different types. So basically people chose varieties for adoption that increased the range of options for their village. Yeah? But what we're seeing now that there have been hybrids released, that initially we were working with also a lot of 6 or 8 different hybrids that different groups were producing and selling, that there's really a concentration on 2 or 3 main hybrids that are actually being adopted very widely.
Thank you. So we've got time probably for a couple more questions. Oh, did you want to chip in there, Krista? Go ahead.
Maybe I'll just add a little bit. If we think about how there are these diverse needs across environments and villages and maybe, I guess the point being, and I don't know, breeders can correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe it's a little bit easier to get a lot of varieties out there that farmers can choose from. So they don't have to try and breed this one Shangri-La variety or 3 that work really well, but they can put out there based on developing varieties from these preferences and methods that we've collected so that we understand what is needed in an area or region. And then they can offer a range of varieties that can, maybe there's more chance that these are going to be adopted and carried forward by farmers. If there's, yeah, and maybe it's easier for breeders. I don't know.
Any thought on that one, Eva? Is it going to depend upon varietal release procedures having sufficient flexibility to allow kind of rapid multiple release of varieties? Sometimes it's quite difficult to get it through the variety release regulatory process. Changing tack a little bit. This is from Esther. So Esther asked, Krista, was there data collected on the iron effect on the children's nutrition status? And if so, what were the results?
I actually would like to direct this to Eva because she has a clearer picture of this. I think she has a clearer picture of the results on this.
Thank you for this question, Esther. The answer is very clear. No, we don't have any data on the nutrition status of the children. We only know about the adoption of the varieties and the adoption actually of some recipes for using whole grain, which actually increases the iron content of the meal. The main issue is that we don't have a nutritionist who could do those studies in West Africa.
Okay, so I don't have any more questions coming up. Unless anybody else got a burning question, I think we're probably going to close. So I'd really like to thank both the presenters for giving a fantastically diverse and rich presentation on this very diverse and rich crop. And that was really, really very stimulating. I think it's setting us up really nicely for moving into our, to move ahead with our workshop coming up in October. And also like to thank the participants for joining in and also asking you a couple of nice questions there. So that was also really good. So thanks, everybody. We will be having another webinar. I think it's going to be in about a month or so's time. So we're hoping everybody on this call will be connecting the next time. So thanks again, everybody. And we're going to, I think, close it there. So goodbye.